tout d'abord à Alanus. Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que le développement des data a contribué à augmenter la confiance des citoyens ou au contraire à augmenter la méfiance des citoyens par rapport à ces systèmes?
Yeah, this is, thanks, that's a very good question. I think you referred to the data specifically, right? So we can see, funny enough, two trends when it comes to using data for the development of our cities. We tend to, of course, mistrust a lot of sort of, publicly available data-driven systems. So take, for example, facial recognition. Facial recognition is something that is being tried. For example, it was tried at the Südkreuz station in Berlin, where people, would be recognized, the faces with cameras. Of course, this is what people don't want in Europe, and there is a high degree of, criticism and not trustworthiness in these type of systems that may, that inflict surveillance. On the other hand, we use several data-driven systems very bluntly without really understanding what we do with the data. So we grant all the large platform providers access to our data every day, all the time, by using, by using social media, by using apps on our smartphone all the time. Our smartphone knows exactly where we are all the time, and companies like Google use that information to develop services and offer and sell that to cities. And we don't, we are not really aware of it. We just use it. So I see, so when you ask about trust, I see more the issue of, let's say, a lack of digital literacy. We don't really know. We just don't really understand what is happening with the data. If we don't see it, or we just don't want to read all the, the consent form, we just click OK, I'm fine, and let the company do whatever it does with it, because I get my free Facebook or Google or whatever, and I'm fine with that. On the other hand, if the public sector wants to use my data, no, this is my data. So there's, I would say, a large degree of digital illiteracy, which I think makes us, makes a large degree of untrustfulness in all these digital systems. I believe there's a lot of work in education and information, and in also providing data sovereignty to citizens when it comes to the utilization of the data. There are some concepts for that, but I don't go into detail now. I think it's a bit difficult. Okay.
Thanks. Je voudrais rebondir, non logiquement, non chronologiquement, mais sur la présentation de Kelly, parce qu'au fond, il y a un gap entre les deux présentations. Et ce qui m'a frappé, c'est que, au fond, vous avez présenté ce retour dans l'histoire, le projet de Anglais pour utiliser la ventilation naturelle. Et au fond, est-ce que ça m'a fait penser d'abord, évidemment, Vitruve reste d'une actualité phénoménale. Vous avez donné toutes les règles pour l'implantation d'un nouveau bâtiment par rapport à l'environnement, au climat. Ce sont des choses que nous connaissons depuis des millénaires. Vous m'avez fait penser à un livre récent qui a été publié par un professeur de l'EPFL, Pierre Fray, qui s'appelle « Learning from Vernacular ». Et en effet, vous êtes dans un trend qui est tout à fait intéressant. Et votre ambition de dire on doit revenir avec non pas avec des nouveautés, mais avec des fondamentaux de la construction pour rétablir la Baukultur. C'est quelque chose d'assez comment dire, subversif, si j'ose dire, par rapport à l'autre trend qui est celui de dire on va réussir avec le développement des technologies qui vont être des outils nouveaux. Mais par rapport à la Baukultur, ma question, j'y viens, elle est très longue, pardon. Vous aviez donné 3 thèmes, good design, clean, fair. Est-ce que c'est juste que le good design est la résultante? Si on pense la construction d'une manière fair, c'est-à-dire ce que vous avez dit, avec les producteurs à proximité, d'une manière propre, c'est que une utilitas, au fond la venustas, serait la résultante non conçue au départ.
Yeah. I would say that tripartite of good, clean, fair, like none of them, if there's just one of them, it's not really, you could have a very clean building that's using local labor that's butt ugly, that probably is not going to have the longevity or buy-in because it's not beautiful. And I think, that's where design comes in. I think largely we hopefully we can make beautiful things. That's where I think talent and education comes into it. And then I think also spending the time to understand the clean part, to really understand clean, because we've been pretending we understand clean for decades now, and using it as an alibi, frankly. If we actually understood clean, which relates, I think, a bit to your conversation, and the fair part as well, if we really took the time to understand what fair meant. We have fair coffee, we don't have fair concrete. Why not, right? So if we took the time to actually understand what these things are and slowed down a bit, I think at the beginning of your question, this is a Back to the Future approach, absolutely. I'm kind of curious to know, there was a movement briefly, critical regionalism, that was looking at a kind of at a kind of vernacular regional thing, late 70s, early 80s. It was big in Canada. It died off, and it basically got subsumed to the kind of globalization of generic that we've seen now, since I've been an architect. And I'm just kind of, we need to get back to being regional practitioners. We have no business practicing around the world because we don't really understand the context that we have. We need to be experts once again. I think that is the future of the profession if we're really going to deal with, I think it's the question of our lifetime. Yeah.
Oui, en somme, vous remettez un rôle essentiel à l'architecte comme médiateur et comme éducateur de tous ces processus de production du construit. Et enfin, une question à Jon. J'étais très très frappé par cette mise en question des instruments de mesure. Alors évidemment, cette conclusion de dire que le bonheur n'est pas corrélé à l'augmentation de la richesse individuelle, on peut le constater, on peut en avoir le sentiment. Et comme la question que nous nous posons, c'est peut-on éventuellement avoir une estimation de mesure de la Baukultur? Est-elle en train de croître ou de ne pas croître? Je voudrais vous poser la question par rapport à la grande mobilité que nous avons ici dans les pays occidentaux. Nous allons visiter des villes. Et la plupart des gens qui vont dans une autre ville, sans doute, ont une perception positive. C'est pour ça qu'ils vont dans d'autres villes. Et quand ils reviennent chez eux, ils ont une perception qui est plutôt négative. Est-ce que, selon le point de vue, la mesure d'une culture du bâti peut être complètement inversée?
I think I just don't know the answer to that because we're not collecting that data. But there's many ways in which that can be done. And I think there's all sorts of lessons from work around the world that gives insight into the things that do make people happy, that relate very closely to their cities. So Daniel Kahneman, who, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, but actually a psychologist, has done all this work around day reconstruction methods to understand what actually makes people happy in reality, not what we think makes us happy, because there's often a big disconnect. And the classic example of the disconnect is you ask any parent what makes you happy, and they'll typically say spending time with my children, that makes me happy. look at the actual data where people are wearing a sensor or carrying a smartphone. What are you doing? How do you feel? What are you doing spending time with my kids? How do you feel? Really unhappy because 9% of the time they're fighting and they're arguing and not eating their dinner, and we know what it's like, but those who've got kids. But then, 2 days later, we look back and we think, oh, like they're so nice. And that's why it's conditioned to people. That's why we have second children. If we actually remembered the hell of the first child, there's no way anyone surely would have a second kid. So there is this disconnect. And one of the things that Danny Kahneman found, for example, that I think is an example of this, is one of the things that makes people the most unhappy day to day is commuting. People hate it everywhere. It's uniformly miserable when we're commuting, and yet in many countries there is this lie people are told: buy a big house in the suburbs, that will make you happy, and it's just not true. Mm-hmm. So looking at some of that data, I think, could really be informative to things that perhaps architects already know, but citizens don't necessarily, and they need to think again about this.
Alors je vous propose de prendre les premières questions venues par Slido. On va être banal, on va prendre celle qui a reçu le plus d'approbation. Elle est pour vous, Kelly.
Yeah, sure.
C'est une variante de la question que vous posiez vous-même. What is the person for research in the mass budget? Is it an exception, or can we all do it?
Yeah, that's actually, there's a version of this question that part of the session yesterday. How do we pay for research? I'm not going to give you the time and money answer. So we're a nonprofit, and I think what that has allowed us to do is raise funding. At this point, 20% of our revenue is through philanthropy, fundraising, grant applications. So we can go out and actually apply for grants as a nonprofit where you couldn't as a for-profit. And that's opened up a world of funding to us to be able to pursue some of this research. Part of, again, looking at the conversation yesterday about how do you prove out design? You need to be involved post-ribbon cutting, post-occupancy. There's never a budget line item to involve the architect for 5 years after. If you're still talking to them, it's, good job. To actually spend the time to actually, how is it performing per the assumptions we made? That's where we've been able to get a few grants to go in and spend time with the users and ask them questions and ultimately publish that work. So that's the answer to that question.
Est-ce qu'on peut avoir les autres questions? Alors c'est une question pour Alanus. Le développement de ce genre de technologie dans l'espace public, comme dans cette rue animée à Eindhoven, permet-il vraiment d'améliorer la qualité de l'environnement bâti, ou est-il seulement limité à mieux surveiller la population?
Okay, so the translator wasn't able to translate. Let me try whether I get it in French.
So the development data in public space.
Whether it would actually improve the environment, or rather we run the risk of being surveyed.
Only surveyed.
Yes.
Because it's open space data.
Well, so I think there is substantial value that we can get from digital systems in our cities, because we can by using them, we can really make our traffic system, for example, much more fluid. We can we can have intermodal sort of mobility as a service apps on our smartphone, which then help us to not own a car anymore, but just book a trip and use the scooter, a car, the public transportation as we move along the city. And all of this is run on data, right? To share things in a city, to share not only cars, but also, whatever we need for daily life. How often do you need a screw, like an electric screwdriver? Like you need it maybe once a year. So we can share these things, right? But we can only do it if we know, so if we have the data. And therefore, I think, yes, the digital and extension of the city is definitely helping us to improve our urban life. Another example is only think about our need to shift to renewable energies. So wind is not always blowing, sun is not always shining, but we have to shift to these sources of energy to reach our emission targets. So we can only do that if we balance the energy, if we store the energy, and if we have intelligent systems that adapt energy flow to the demand of the energy in the buildings. That means we need to measure all that and link it into systems. And I don't see how we will manage our transition to more sustainable cities if we don't use these technologies. On the other hand, yes, there is the danger of surveillance, of doing bad stuff with the data from people. There are some technologies that help us prevent this. One is what we call edge computing. So for example, that you have directly in the sensor, you have a small computer that takes away all the personal information from the data that is gathered. So for example, if a camera is filming pedestrians in the street or cyclists or whatever, you take away all the parts of the image, and you only have some small dots moving along, and you can tag the dots with being a cyclist, being a pedestrian, whatever. For example, if we use mobile phone data to understand movement patterns in cities, we need to make sure to anonymize that. That means there is a form of data aggregation that you have a minimum of five individuals in one cluster, which is the minimum amount of individuals to not be able to trace back to one single individual. So there are these systems in place. They're also prescribed. But of course, I believe there should be, we need to go beyond that. I believe where we need to come is we need to have a regulation that forces or enables us to look into the algorithms that companies or whoever creates them do with data that comes from the public realm, right? So I think we need a regulation to make algorithms transparent in order to not only have the data nerds at Google or wherever understand what the algorithms do, but have an enhanced transparency and literacy on what the data does.
Vous posez vraiment le problème. That's the problem. The governments don't have that knowledge.
Yes, there is. There is a good example from the city of New York.
Some.
Yes.
But not all.
Not yet. Yes.
Yeah.
It's new, right?
Yeah.
It's new for all of us because we've been kind of like, it's like a wave of digital transformation which caught on us, and all of our systems are not prepared for it, right? Neither the law, nor the municipalities, nor we as citizens. It is something that we all need to grapple with. So some cities are better in doing it. In Europe, I would say London is the city that has the best system of using data, aggregating data, and giving data sovereignty back to their citizens. And London has made a regulation that is actually forcing companies that operate on public space data, or data that comes from the public space, to open up their algorithms so they can be reviewed by experts.
Yeah. Your presentation of the Uber
Yes.
case or Airbnb case is a major problem that our governments are have big difficulties to fight and to come to a new social contract. That's effective. Est-ce que nous avons d'autres questions ou est-ce que vous voudriez la poser de manière directe?
Merci. I have a question for the Rwanda project. You make a lot of research, and you have a lot of positive results. And do you pass on all the knowledge? Is there a program with the local people you're working with so that they can build other buildings on their own or with the government, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's an exciting context to practice. So we're working with the governments like the Rwandan Housing Authority, which oversees building code and construction, to help write building code standards for earth construction, which had previously did not exist. It had been illegal to use earth blocks. So we've been working with them to write code, train their staff on understanding it, designing for seismicity. It's a high seismic zone, but few of the engineers come out of school with any seismic training. So we've been working hard to influence building code and get upstream on the policy side of things. And then on the other end of it, we've started a construction company too. So we're trying to build some of our own projects and really engage the labor quotient. The projects that we have built or operated as a general contractor on, on the question of fair, we have a school that we built that the construction force was half women. We had gender equity on a job site, which is, I'd say, extraordinarily rare. So these are the types of things that we're trying to do.
Yeah, I just, having heard what everything we heard from yesterday, and being member of the editorial committee for Baukultur and for the Davos Declaration, for me the main point is how to measure, how to have the right metrics for evaluate the quality of Baukultur or the quality of living spaces. That's the main issue. At the end of this morning, what we can really see that it's a real problem. How to do it, and do you see, as professionals in your fields, do you see something moving in the economist world towards forgetting GDP, going to something else? I'm not an economist, so I don't know what, but something else could be the good tools to measure well-being, quality, going from quantity to quality.
And we have the first question: how to design measurement criteria to integrate a sensitivity towards representativity and non-Western cultural realities. That's for both of you, perhaps.
Go ahead.
I think the first point about whether the economists are changing, the answer has to be yes. In the 20 years ago, this idea of looking beyond GDP was seen as really a fringe idea, and now governments around the world are working on this. I met Angela Merkel talk about this a few years ago. It's serious business. There are serious people involved, and they get it. So there is definitely a shift, and it feels to me very slow sometimes. But then I think back 20 years ago, and it's been huge. In terms of, I think what I would say is it's extremely important to measure Baukultur, but also to recognize you'll probably never measure it perfectly, but don't let that stop you. Because once you have these measures, and even the conversation you have as a community and with citizens about how to measure it, what's important, will also give very important insights. The process is as important, if not more important, than the product. I think the non-Western part, yes, of course, there are differences, I'm sure, just as there are differences in what makes life worthwhile and progress and development. But when you actually sit down, at least for the sort of general questions, and you look at countries that have asked this, is our country getting better? And you can compare Bhutan with Britain, and it's essentially the same sort of measures. People aspire to similar things. There may be different priorities people put on their living space, but I think essentially the same measures will be there. And if you were my suggestion would be to develop a set of indicators, a few indicators that cover different areas, and then present those, and people can decide for themselves whether it's getting better overall. It might be in Switzerland you care very much about a clean, green environment, whereas in Mexico City it's time with family and friends. Both are important in both countries, but they may be different weights or different priorities. To let people have that assessment for themselves and have that conversation, but giving them the facts lets the conversation start from a clear starting point and common ground. The worst thing is when people don't have the facts and they spend their whole time, as most politicians do, arguing about the data, not the substance, just arguing about the facts.
I think like this question is the crux of this whole event, and I think that what you said, I think just by measuring things, you're giving value to it, you're going to get people thinking about it, right? And I think back to the wheel that we have, that early on with any user group or any client that we're ultimately working with, we spent a lot of time, we spent like a day just trying to figure out what are the measurements that would indicate a successful project. And and it's like I really want this. Okay, then the next question is, well, how would you measure, like, whether or not we're achieving that? And it really creates different ways of looking at a project. It's not just about cost per square meter at that point. So for instance, working with a NICU right now in London, and they want to get parents more engaged in the caregiving to the children for a number of reasons. And so, like, what are the ways that you could measure that the building the design and the renovation is empowering parents to be more engaged in the care of their children? Simple things like how many diapers are they changing, would be a kind of little indicator that would have a design driver to it, or the well-being of the staff, and like how much time are they spending on the floor versus an area of individual refuge. Things like this that then feed into your programming, that feed into the hypothesis of why you're putting, ultimately when you're designing and building something, you're putting something new into the world that's intended to improve the context. So you'd want to have some assumptions about how it's improving it from the beginning, built into the project that you could then track against. And I think what we've had, I'm just speaking as an architect with really broad brushes here, but we have a fundamental, I think, issue with validating our service a lot of time, where we're seen as a luxury and not a necessity. And I think that this way of understanding our practice, our profession, as a means of improving society through tangible things that are, quantitative and qualitative. I think like this gives us a language to come back into it differently, and not just about pro forma execution and cash flow and all the other conversation that happened yesterday. That's like so dead for our profession, has led us to where we are. And I think this is where I think there's the work you're doing has potential to, how do you then begin to track that data, crowdsource it a bit more? I mean, there's a risk of it being too democratic and too Twitterfied, that only the worst ideas, emerge. But I think that this, there is some promise here in arriving on key metrics together and finding a way to actually track them through the users that use the space.
Yeah, just to add to this, and also with regards to your question, I think today we have much more opportunities to measure things in an objective way than we had before, because we are now really able. So we, for example, we help municipalities create small sensor kits, and set up a small LoRaWAN network in their city center, and then start measuring things. It's simple. It doesn't cost a lot. And there's sort of ready-to-deploy kits available, which we can use to measure street quality, footfall, air quality levels, all these things. And I think so. I quite like the talk from Matthew, who was showing us this letter. There are some, I guess, key requirements that account for almost every place on this planet, or for every city on this planet, like green space, reduction of car use, walkability. Some density, and we can track and we can measure this today with electronic devices. We can measure it, and we can generate evidence in real time, and we can create histories and see how then the quality changes over time. But of course, this needs to, and I believe this is also your point about democratic co-creation. This needs to be measured against brought in comparison to a very local, very cultural sensitive approach of the local culture. So if you are able to have let's say an objective measurement of some key elements of Baukultur, and then have a democratic, digitally based feedback system that allows you to understand how do people in that specific situation actually feel and walk and behave, and are they happy in that situation. That really, I think, would bring us a step ahead. And I think today and yesterday we've heard quite a lot of building blocks and puzzle pieces of this type of a measurement system which we could deploy in the future.
I think your comment, I mean, basically you're talking about how data can be scrubbed.
Yeah.
And like boiled down a little bit. Yeah. And I think scrub is probably a better word. And I think that this is the challenge a little bit right now, where your median curve, like the actual truth is in here, but what we perceive as the truth are the outliers. I think that's the kind of challenge of data and how it can help form opinion a bit. I don't know how, because the current representation of data is the outlier and not the median. And there's something in that scrubbing that's required, and it does not exist right now. Wish it did.
Yes, well, this also I think adds to one specific point which I want to make before leaving, because I think we also need to be clear that, of course, most of us are very digital, and we use all these digital tools in our everyday lives, but not everyone is. There is still people who are not using smartphones. There's people who are not, who may not want to be connected. So, and therefore, I think we always, when we think about design, we always have to think about resilience of that type of design. So is it resilient with regards to different to different groups of the population, to children who are not able to give digital feedback, maybe to elderly people, so these things I think are very, very important to have in mind when asking the question about Baukultur and about measuring it. For who do we measure it as well? For who does it work?
I would like to have more information what is happening with your buildings that are very beautiful, that are very fair on a long time.
From a durability perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you make with these buildings within the next 30, 40 years? Because they will be used, they will be changed. Perhaps they will be changed not in a manner that is very Baukultur-like.
Or not.
Do you follow these buildings?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've only been around for 10 years, so that hospital, the one that got us started, for our last company retreat, we went and sanded all the posts and refinished them and did some painting and did some gardening and, went and helped the maintenance team, maintain the building. I think the question of durability has two answers. One is design for durability. I think your 3-meter floor to ceiling or floor to floor, we need to move towards more standardized approaches to architecture that allow building flexibility and longevity from a multiplicity of users. I'm just looking at the fact that this room used to be partitioned at one point and then they decided to remove it, which, there you go. But so that question of flexibility is the first one. Durability is really one, I think, of emotional connection and economics, but I think it's more about the question of, does this community own the building? And in the case of this hospital, there's this cultural practice in Rwanda called Umuganda. The last Saturday of every month, a group gets together and does a community service together. And they decide the month prior what they're going to work on the next month. And so our projects have been quite often the recipients of this community labor to go and do things around the project to help maintain them. All buildings require maintenance. If it's a public building, it's built in their budget, you'd hope. But the other part, the people who feel like a hospital, this community sees that hospital as it is their building on the hilltop. It is where they get their health and refuge. They have actually come to take care of it. So I think figuring out a way to connect community, and they literally built it themselves in the first place, they feel emotionally connected to it. So I think figuring out ways to get people involved in its maintenance, that's a big question of how to do that. Do they actually know how to do plaster and painting and lay a brick or fix the plumbing? These are things that we as human beings should know. These should be like our basic parts of our education, I would say, in school. Certainly if you're an architect, if you've never laid a brick, you probably shouldn't be drawing one. These are ways I think that deal with that question of durability.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. C'était une discussion très animée qui vous a réunis tous les trois pour terminer, mais je ne voudrais pas vous torturer davantage, c'est l'heure du lunch. Je crois que la première moitié de l'audience est déjà servie et donc vous aurez tout le confort pour accéder aux nourritures que nous vous avons préparées. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.